In the last lecture, we began to consider how the behavioral ecology of a species reflects the way individuals adaptively modify their behavior in response to the environment in which they find themselves. Specifically, we saw how the behavior expressed by individuals changes in a way that maximizes the difference between the costs and benefits that are accrued by that particular behavior. The costs of behavior, we saw, sometimes have to be measured in more complex terms than simple energy and resources, and may include as well kinds of costs we refer to as risk costs or opportunity costs. We also saw how whether or not individuals lived in groups also might be predicted by considering the relative costs and benefits associated with social behavior. In this sense, we saw how conspecifics themselves, and by conspecifics I mean individuals of the same species, how conspecifics themselves might serve as kind of a resource for an individual in a population. If there's some benefit to living in a group, for example, this benefit is conferred by the presence of other individuals of the same species, and in that sense, those individuals are resources. Now, in today's lecture, we're going to continue our discussion of behavioral ecology by considering the costs and benefits not just of associating with other individuals in a group, but more specifically, the consequences of interacting with particular individuals in the population. Now, let's begin this discussion by categorizing the different kinds of social interactions that could occur among individuals in a social group, categorizing them according to whether they result in a benefit or a cost to each of the two individuals that are participating in an interaction. Now, there are four such categories we could define. Let me just list these for you quickly and then explain what I mean by them. These four categories include what I'll call cooperative interactions, selfish interactions, altruistic interactions, and what we'll call spiteful interactions. Now, if a behavioral interaction benefits both the individual performing the act and the recipient of that act, then we refer to that behavior as a cooperative act. Okay? We refer to an interaction that benefits the performer of the interaction, but in fact costs the recipient of that act a selfish act. In other words, if an individual does something to another individual and in so doing benefits itself but costs the other individual something, we would refer to that as selfish. Now, if an individual costs the individual, if an interaction costs the performer of some behavioral act something, but benefits the recipient of that act, that's what we refer to as an altruistic act. So an altruistic act costs something of the individual who does it, but benefits the individual to which it's done. And finally, if an interaction incurs some cost to both the performer of the act and the recipient of the act, then we would refer to that as a spiteful interaction. Now, the question we want to ask is under what circumstances behaviors falling into these four categories might be observed in a population of organisms. In general, it's pretty easy to imagine that both cooperative and selfish behaviors would be observed in any population. If a social interaction confers a benefit, a greater benefit than cost, to the individual performing that interaction, of course we would imagine that natural selection would select for individuals to perform those kinds of behaviors because they're acquiring something from that. It really doesn't matter directly whether the recipient of that behavior itself benefits or incurs a cost. The only thing that matters is whether the performer of the behavior, the animal that actually initiates the behavior, is benefiting. And in the case of both cooperative and selfish behavior, the individual doing the act is benefiting. So of course we would expect these kinds of behaviors to evolve. Now, it's harder to understand how either altruistic or spiteful behaviors might evolve, and the reason is because both of these kinds of behaviors actually cost the individual that's performing the behavior something. Well, we don't have to worry too much about spiteful behaviors. They may occur, or we might think they occur, in human interactions, but we don't really see in animals, in the interactions of animals in a social group, anything that we would want to call spiteful in the sense that both the individual performing the act and the individual on the receiving end of the act both incur some cost. Altruistic behavior, on the other hand, is another matter. We often see cases where individuals will perform a behavior that costs them something to do that behavior and benefits some other individual. This is a puzzle because on face value, altruistic behaviors shouldn't evolve because the individuals that perform those behaviors are suffering costs and therefore should not be selected for in a population. Well, what I want to do for the next few moments is to ask how altruistic behaviors can occur in social interactions. But first, let me give you a couple of specific examples of kinds of altruistic behaviors we see in animal populations. Now, the first example I want to tell you about involves the behavior of a species of squirrel called the Belding's ground squirrel. This is a species that's been studied for many years by Paul Sherman at Cornell University. The Belding's ground squirrel is a western species of ground squirrel. It's similar in size and shape to the chipmunks that you might find in the east part of the country. Unlike chipmunks, however, Belding's ground squirrels live in colonies. They're very, very social animals. Belding's ground squirrel colonies occur in large open areas. They actually occur in alpine meadows out in the western mountains. And the individuals living in these meadows are very vulnerable to many kinds of predators, including things like hawks that come at them from the air or coyotes that might sneak up on them through the grass. Like many social animals, these ground squirrels have a particular signal that they give in response to seeing a predator, a signal we refer to as an alarm call. So if a Belding's ground squirrel spots a hawk flying overhead, it will give a characteristic call. A call associated just with the observation of that hawk. That alarm call is detected by other individuals in the population who actually literally will look up, see the hawk, and take cover. Now, this alarm call has an obvious cost to the individual who gives it, because the alarm call makes that individual more obvious. It's that individual in the crowd who says essentially, "Hey, look out!" making itself stick out from the crowd and more vulnerable to predation itself. And indeed, you can demonstrate that individual Belding's ground squirrels who give alarm calls are more likely to be taken by the predator that they spot. Now, the recipients of this behavior, the other individuals on the meadow who hear the alarm call, obviously benefit. They benefit because they're now being warned that a predator is around that they might not have detected themselves otherwise. The question is this: how can the production of alarm calls evolve if the individuals giving those alarm calls are the ones that are incurring greater costs, whereas the individuals not giving those alarm calls are the ones that are benefiting? Well, before we try to answer that question, let's consider a second example of an altruistic behavior. This example involves a species of African bird called the white-fronted bee-eater. This is a bird that's been studied for many years by Steve Emlen, who's also at Cornell. Bee-eaters live in large colonies that include many nesting pairs, all associated very closely with each other. Now, the interesting thing about bee-eater colonies is that most of the male-female pairs that are breeding will receive assistance in raising their young from other adults in the population, both other males and other females, who are not themselves breeding. These non-breeding birds who assist other pairs we call helpers. And what they're doing is helping at the nests of other individuals. Now, helpers actually help in many ways. They bring food to the young in that nest. They will defend the nest. These animals actually live in nest holes and banks. They'll defend the nest from predators or other individuals. They'll keep an eye out for what's going on. Helpers actually benefit the nest itself, and you can demonstrate this by showing that nests having helpers will be more likely to fledge young, that is, have the young successfully leave the nest, or raise more young over a period of time. Now, I want to point out that these helpers in bee-eater colonies are fully adult birds. They have reached reproductive age, and they're fully capable, physiologically, of reproducing themselves. But helpers forego their own reproduction. And instead of producing their own young, they help other pairs produce their young. Again, the question is, how can this altruistic behavior evolve if the animal performing the behavior is suffering a cost? In this case, the cost of not reproducing, while as the animal receiving the behavior, the pair that is being helped, are the animals that are incurring the benefits. Well, the answer to both questions, the answer to both of these puzzling kinds of behaviors, comes from understanding the genetic relatedness of individuals in these social groups. Specifically, altruistic behaviors are most likely to occur when the individuals performing those behavioral acts, those altruistic acts, are closely related to the individuals that are receiving the benefits of that behavior. Now, why should this be? Well, the reason for this is that an individual organism can enhance its own reproductive success actually in one of two ways. Now, first, as we already know from our discussion of evolution, an individual obviously enhances its own reproductive success directly by producing its own offspring. We called this Darwinian fitness earlier on in the course. This is the fitness that we've already discussed. It's an individual's own production of offspring. But second, and this is less intuitive, an individual can increase its own fitness indirectly by promoting the survival and reproduction of close relatives, for example, parents or brothers or sisters. Now, let's look at this second way of increasing fitness in a little more detail. We usually think of reproductive success in terms of the production of offspring, but in fact, what's really important, as we learned way back when we were talking about population genetics, is the transmission of alleles from one generation to the next. Right? This is the point we made when we used population genetic models to ask how any kind of trait might evolve. If alleles for that trait increase in the gene pool of a population, then that trait will evolve. So what's really mattering here is the alleles that get passed on to the next generation. Now, by helping a closely related individual, an animal promotes the transmission to the next generation of many of the same alleles it has in its own cells. And it does that because closely related individuals will share many of these same alleles. Now, the extent to which any two individuals in a population share alleles because they're related is called the coefficient of relatedness. Each of you, for example, shares on average about 50% of your alleles with each of your parents. And on average, you share about 50% of your alleles with each of your siblings, your brothers or your sisters. So your coefficient of relatedness with these individuals, with your parents or your siblings, is 0.5. Now, I won't bother you with the details of the calculation. It's actually not very difficult algebra, but you could easily calculate the coefficient of relatedness between any two more distantly related relatives. For example, you share on average about 12.5% of your alleles with your first cousins. And so therefore we'd say that your coefficient of relatedness with first cousins is 0.125. Thus, an individual can increase its genetic representation in the next generation not only by producing its own offspring, which obviously transmits its alleles to the next generation, but also by helping close relatives produce their offspring. Because those close relatives will also be transmitting the same alleles, or some fraction of them on average, to the next generation. The total fitness of an individual includes both its own production of offspring, what we call direct fitness, and also this production of alleles, this transmission of alleles to the next generation through relatives, which we call the animal's inclusive fitness. The mechanism by which animals increase their inclusive fitness, their overall fitness in terms of allele transmission, by aiding the survival and reproduction of closely related individuals is called kin selection. So inclusive fitness and kin selection provide us with a framework for understanding how altruistic behaviors can arise. An individual can perform an act which is detrimental to its own reproduction or survival as long as it enhances the reproduction of a close relative to a corresponding degree. Actually, the old adage is you can jump into the river to save one brother or four cousins. It's the same chance you take. Now, when the benefits of increasing the reproductive success of related individuals exceeds the costs of decreasing the altruist's own reproductive success, then the altruist's inclusive fitness is enhanced and the behavior can evolve. Well, let's go back to the two examples of altruistic behavior I gave you already to illustrate how this works. Let's start with alarm calling in Belding's ground squirrels. Now, first, it's necessary for me to give you a little more background on the behavior of these animals. Young male Belding's ground squirrels tend to disperse from their home population, what we'd call their natal population. On average, a young male ground squirrel, when it becomes independent, will move about 1/4 of a kilometer, maybe even more, from wherever it was born before they settle down. Now, by contrast, young female Belding's ground squirrels stay put. They move hardly at all. They might move only 20 or 30 meters away from the burrow in which they were born. As a consequence of this difference in dispersal patterns, Females are likely to live near their close relatives. They've stayed at home. They've stayed around their family. Whereas males have dispersed, and they're more likely to be living with individuals to which they're not closely related. Well, this difference then suggests a specific prediction. It suggests that if we go into a population of Belding's ground squirrels, females should be the ones giving more alarm calls as compared to males. Why? Because females have more close relatives on average in a population than do males. And this is precisely what we see. Almost all of the alarm calls given in a Belding's ground squirrel population, well, the majority of them are given by females, and males call relatively little. Now, this difference between the calling behavior of females and males, given the dispersal distance difference we discussed, is consistent with the hypothesis that kin selection is responsible for the evolution of alarm calling and altruistic behavior. Actually, another interesting test that comes from this work on Belding's ground squirrel involves the prediction that females should differ in how much they alarm call, depending on how many close relatives they have in a population. And it turns out you can figure out how many close relatives a female has in a population, and if a female happens to live in a population where she doesn't have a lot of close relatives, then she calls relatively little, just like a male would. Again, consistent with the kin selection hypothesis. Now let's consider the case of the bee eater. A close look at who helps whom in a colony shows that bee eater helpers usually only help their relatives. Now, most often, helpers are helping their own parents or their siblings, that is, individuals having a coefficient of relatedness with them of 0.5. Sometimes bee eaters will help more distantly related individuals. For example, they might help cousins, or they might help half-siblings. Now, these more distantly related individuals will have a smaller coefficient of relatedness with the individuals that are helping. And so we predict that we would see helping occurring less often, if it does occur at all, with these less closely related individuals. And this is just what's seen in a colony of bee eaters. Most of the helping is to closely related individuals, but if you look at less closely related individuals, such as half-siblings, you still see helping occurring, but proportionately less. And as you move even farther away in relatedness, say to cousins, then you might still see some helping, but it's even less. Just as you would predict if kin selection was the mechanism responsible for the evolution of helping in bee eaters. Well, the occurrence of altruistic behavior in the first place, along with the fact that this kind of social behavior is directed specifically towards relatives, illustrates how particular individuals in a population can be disproportionately more important to an individual than other individuals. What I mean by this, what I mean by more important, is more important in the sense of determining how an individual might allocate time and effort in interactions with other individuals. It's more likely, for example, to be altruistic with closely related individuals predicted by kin selection. Now, the close genetic relatives an individual has in a population obviously are an important focus of its behavior because of kin selection. But other kinds of individuals in a population may be particularly important for other reasons. Certainly, the most significant kind of interaction occurring in a population of organisms is between individuals that are going to mate together. In fact, choosing a mate may be one of the most important things an individual does in its lifetime, because the choice of the mate may be one of the most important determinants of that individual's reproductive success. Thus, among all the individuals in a population that have a special role to play in determining how individuals interact with each other socially, the most important of these are probably individuals who potentially will be mates. What I'd like to do then for the rest of this lecture is to consider the problem of how individuals choose mates, to get a feel for the significance of this process for understanding the behavioral ecology of an organism. Well, the first thing to point out is that we often observe an asymmetry in the way that males and females go about choosing a mate. Males, on average, in most species, or in many species, usually are the sex that initiates courtship. Males often compete with other males for access to females or for opportunities to mate with females. Females, on the other hand, typically appear to be the choosier sex. That is to say, females often choose among different competing males, often rejecting some males in favor of others. Now, the reason for this commonly observed asymmetry is usually explained in light of the fact that females pay a higher cost of reproduction. Now, the cost of reproduction, or the difference in cost of reproduction between males and females, may actually on the cellular level be as simple as the fact that female gametes tend to be larger and more costly to produce than male gametes, which tend to be very small and less costly. Now, in most cases, however, the cost of reproduction goes well beyond just the cost of producing one gamete, and it involves all sorts of other things. For example, in mammals, there's an enormous cost of reproduction, a cost that's borne by the female, which is the cost of actually developing the young embryo for a significant period of time inside the body of the female. Other species pay other kinds of costs that, again, are disproportionately weighted towards females than to males. For example, organisms like birds or lizards will produce eggs, and not only is the female putting a gamete into those eggs, but putting an enormous amount of other resource into that egg as well. So in general, females are paying a higher price for reproducing, and therefore we expect them to be choosier, because the cost of reproduction is higher. Now, I'd like to point out that in many cases, females are not necessarily the choosier sex. There are many examples of sex role reversed species, and even species that aren't obviously sex role reversed might have females being less choosy and males being more choosy. But in general, for a typical species, there's usually a choosier sex and a chosen sex, or a less choosy sex. And more often than not, it's the female that is the choosy sex in a species. And so what we want to do then is, just for the sake of convenience, consider the problem of mate choice from this perspective, females choosing males. Now, the observation that one sex, usually females, tends to be choosier than the other leads us to an important question, which is, what does a female gain from being choosy? In other words, what are the benefits of mate choice? Why not just mate with anybody? Well, in general, there are two possible answers to that question. One possible answer is that the female, or whichever the choosier sex is, might benefit from choosing a particular male because that male will provide her offspring with superior genes. What the female is going after is a male that has a superior set of alleles, superior for some reason, like superior for growth, superior in terms of the ability to resist disease, and so forth. We call these kinds of benefits, by the way, indirect benefits, because they indirectly benefit the female by providing good genes, we might say, for her offspring. Now, a female might also benefit from choosing a particular male to mate with because that male actually directly provides better resources to her. Resources that could include, for example, the holding of a better territory, or a greater contribution to the care of the young, or better defense against predators, and so forth. We call these kinds of benefits direct benefits. Now, sorting out the actual benefits that a female receives in any particular case from choosing a particular male can be difficult in practice, especially demonstrating that she might be receiving some sort of good genes. And it's quite a controversial subject in the area of behavioral ecology as to how to do that. But in general, the assumption is that females are benefiting either indirectly and or directly. And this then leads to the next question we want to ask, which is, how does a female identify a superior male? That is, how does a female tell that a particular male has superior genes, or will provide more resources to her, and so forth? The answer to this question also has been the subject of debate for some time, in fact, since Darwin's time. But it appears now that at least part of the answer has to do with the fact that males display traits that reliably signal something about their quality that matters to females. Consider an African bird called the long-tailed widow bird to make this point. This bird gets its name from the fact that the tail feathers of the male of this species are disproportionately long, extending perhaps twice the length of the bird's head and the remainder of its body. So it's quite a long-tailed bird. The elongated tail feathers of this widow bird are just one example of a very common pattern, which is that the chosen sex of a particular species often displays a variety of kind of elaborate ornaments or performs elaborate courtship behaviors. These are the sorts of things that are the stuff that nature shows on TV are made of. Animals dancing around with colorful displays and fancy body patterns and so forth. We call these kinds of ornaments and courtship displays in general sexually selected traits. We call them that because Darwin himself puzzled about how such traits could evolve. To a first approximation, they don't seem as though they would benefit the individual holding those traits at all. For example, how does the long tail of the widow bird benefit the male? In fact, you might think that this actually would be some hindrance to the male, making it harder for the male to fly, harder to get away from predators, so forth. Well, what Darwin suggested was that these traits evolve specifically because they help the individuals that possess them attract or obtain more mates. And so he called these kinds of traits sexually selected as opposed to naturally selected. Now, a sexually selected trait might improve the ability of an individual to gain access to mates by competing with other individuals. So, for example, many of the elaborate weapons we see on animals, like the horns of ungulate animals, deer and so forth, those kinds of weapons would be considered sexually selected traits because the males use them in combat, competing for access to females. Darwin also suggested, however, that a trait could be sexually selected if it simply made the bearer of that trait more attractive to females. Let's take a look at this long-tailed widow bird example again to see if we can see if we can demonstrate that this kind of trait could actually be attractive to females. In a very clever experiment, a Swedish behavioral ecologist named Malte Andersson demonstrated in this species of long-tailed widow birds that the long tail itself was attractive for females. He did this simply by taking a population of widow birds, catching a bunch of the males, and changing the length of their tails. For some males, he would shorten the tail, literally by cutting the tail feathers shorter and trimming them off so they looked like a natural tail feathers. In other males, he would lengthen the tail length. He would do that by gluing extra tail feather pieces on. And yet, in other males, as a control, he would cut part of the tail off and then put it back on, just to make sure that the manipulation of the tail itself didn't somehow affect female choice. Well, what Andersson found when he did that was that the males that had the longer tails, even tails that were longer than you would normally see in a population, in fact attracted more females, as measured in this case by the number of nests that the male would have in his territory. These are a kind of bird where a male will mate with many females in one nesting cycle. Males with the longest tails had more nests of females. Males with the shortest tails had fewer nests of females, and males with tails of intermediate lengths had an intermediate number of females on their territories. These data, and similar demonstrations done with other sexually selected traits, demonstrate that females are basing their mate choice decision, at least in part, on this trait itself. In the case of the widow bird, on the length of the tail. So then we've shown that females are basing mate choice decisions on these sexually selected traits. The final question we want to ask then is why? Why do females base their decision on something that seems as arbitrary as the length of the tail or any other exaggerated sexually selected trait? Well, the answer to this question is still being debated, but one probable answer is that the ability of a male to express a sexually selected trait, such as the length of the tail in widow birds, reflects that male's overall vitality and vigor. In other words, the expression of the sexually selected trait provides an accurate indicator of a male's overall quality. Now, this hypothesis can only work if the ability of the male to actually produce the sexually selected trait depends in some way on his quality. In the case of something like the widow bird's tail, the hypothesis suggests that only males that have sufficient resources in their life history budget, can devote enough of those resources to producing a long tail while at the same time supporting its other needs, such as maintenance or growth or reproduction. Several experiments have now begun to demonstrate, indirectly though, that this is the case, that males that have more resources, males that are what we would say in higher condition, are simply able to produce bigger tails or more exaggerated traits of other kinds. And because it's only those males that can produce those more exaggerated traits that do produce those traits, the female can use the production of those traits as an accurate indicator of the male's quality in terms of his resource acquisition and use. Well, the field of behavioral ecology is all about making choices. These choices reflect the flexible responses that individuals in a population make to maximize their acquisition and allocation of resources. Now, among the most important choices that an animal makes concerns how it interacts with other individuals in a population and who it interacts with. And these patterns, in turn, can be understood by considering what it costs for an animal to behave in a particular way towards a particular individual. Even such a fundamentally important behavior as mate choice. Even in this case, we've seen how the costs of producing a sexually selected indicator trait may play a key role in the way that courtship works, allowing those animals who are choosing mates to choose a mate that allows the choosing animal to maximize its own benefits that they receive from that choice.